This is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're going to take a look back at the most influential movies within the 2000s decade. Note that these are films that aren't necessarily the highest grossing ones, but the movies that made the most cultural impact, breaking new ground and setting a trend for what was to happen in the current decade and also what was to follow in the next one afterwards. So we'll start off this list then with superheroes, a genre that we will revisit a few times within this breakdown, and we focus on one of the most iconic superheroes of all time, and that is with Spider-Man. After many years in development hell, the web slinger finally saw his first big budget cinematic movie released in 2002. Brought to the big screen by Sony with horror director Sam Raimi at the helm, it had leading actor Tobey Maguire as the role of Peter Parker, starring alongside Kristen Dunst, James Franco and Willem Dafoe. Very much the origin story of Spider-Man, with Peter Parker taking on the heroic role before going up against the Green Goblin. And the first big movie for the character captivated audiences with its large-scale action and at the time, effects that were good enough to convince us that Spider-Man could be swinging amongst the large skyscrapers within New York City. But it also had the strong heart and emotional weight within its characters, and it was every bit the blockbuster phenomenon that Superman the movie was back in 1978 and also Tim Burton's Batman was in 1989. And what Spider-Man showed was the continued renaissance of the comic book movie genre that was resuscitated first with Blade in 1998 and then shortly afterwards with X-Men in 2000. And Spider-Man was that huge sign of how massive these superhero movies could be, grossing huge from totals of around $500 million to $1 billion worldwide, and really dominate the movie industry, and the two following sequels would be equally as successful. So we then go on to the next entry on this list, and I suppose we do have to mention Avatar, James Cameron's behemoth science fiction adventure set in a distant future on planet Pandora, where the alien native species known as the Na'vi have to protect their planet from the Earth invaders. Now, to be honest, it can be argued that despite going on to become the highest grossing movie all time on its release, the lasting legacy really hasn't been there as to what it should have been. But Avatar did introduce the 3D innovation of a fully immersive experience in cinemas, which gave it almost a theme park-like attraction that audiences simply had to see for themselves on the big screen. And for a short while it did set a trend of 3D releases for blockbuster movies, though the ones that followed Avatar were simply post-conversions as studios were looking to cash in quickly on the 3D craze, but that trend didn't last too long. We then move on to a film that had much more stronger impact within the decade, and that is The Bourne Identity. Based on Robert Ludlum's original novel, it had Matt Damon in the lead as Jason Bourne, who after being found in the Mediterranean Sea, discovers he suffers from amnesia and begins a journey to ultimately discover his identity as a CIA spy. After the spectacular high-concept actions from the 1990s, The Bourne Identity brought in a much more physical, grounded reality to the genre. With its leaner pacing and mystery elements, it also paved the way for the more deconstructive action hero who was more mentally flawed and broken. As a character, Jason Bourne lacked the charisma and personality of the classic action heroes from the 1980s and 90s, but audiences found him more realistic and relatable. And with the following two sequels, Bourne Supremacy and also The Bourne Ultimatum, the Bourne series would become one of the most successful action franchises of the decade. Its biggest legacy was being the inspiration of the Daniel Craig James Bond era, which movies clearly adapted the same sensibilities of the breakneck pacing, the somber tone and the ultra quick editing cuts. We then go on to talk about Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first big budget movie adaptation of J.K. Rowling's mega successful novel series, following the role of young boy Harry Potter and his journey of discovery to becoming a wizard. The Harry Potter movies was the biggest cinematic franchise of the decade. The first movie set in the mark, grossing over $970 million on its initial release, but the real impact here was more than commercial. The Harry Potter movies were the first big example of a big franchise that was less reliant on a single movie star or performance and much more about collecting an ensemble of less famous but just as accomplished actors, and that proved that you didn't need to pay an A-list actor multi-millions to sell a film. It really was the beginning of a shift towards relying much more on cultural IPs, and that really was the trend that Harry Potter established within the decade. And that's something that we will see regularly, almost far too often in today's current climate, and there will also be another movie series that set this standard, of which we'll talk about later on within this breakdown. We then return to the superhero genre once more with The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan's sequel this time pitted the Caped Crusader against Heath Ledger's Joker, and having brought the character back to cinematic respectability with the superior Batman Begins, The Dark Knight's popularity and cultural impact was no doubt elevated by the performance and sad passing of Heath Ledger as the Joker. What The Dark Knight also exhibited was that real serious epic comic book movie that, to be honest, feels much more like a large-scale police procedural or a criminal drama. Christopher Nolan's classy and sophisticated movie-making style, with those large city-scale shots and booming Hans Zimmer soundtrack, and modern realistic tone, was at the time deemed the blueprint for the modern superhero movie. And that tone was certainly imitated for both the later James Bond movies and also the Mission Impossible ones. And of course, The Dark Knight succeeded by grossing over $1 billion at the box office, and a continuation of the ascent of the comic book movie within the current decade. We'll then move on to another hugely influential film within the 2000s, and that is with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Ang Lee's eclectic wushu martial arts epic wowed audiences with its almost balletic-like fight sequences, but the movie also carried a sincerity and grace and beauty with a real cinematic verve, and the movie made history by becoming the highest grossing foreign language film within the United States at the time, winning multiple Oscars. But the real impact was the reinvigoration of the martial arts epic into the mainstream audience. This would pave the way for other films such as Hero, House of Flying Daggers, and Memoirs of a Geisha to also enjoy huge international acclaim and success, creating more opportunities for Asian actors such as Chow Yun-fat, Michelle Yeoh, and Sang Se-hee and Andy Lau, who would all become far more prolific within the industry. Now, sadly, the martial arts epic genre, like so many, has been driven much more into streaming in the current times, but certainly at the point of this release, Crouching Tiger definitely became one of the most impactful films within the decade. We then move on to another influential film, and that is with Gladiator. Acclaimed director Ridley Scott's epic gladiatorial story within the Roman Empire sees Russell Crowe's Maximus, once a Roman soldier, now turned into a warrior slave within the Colosseum, vowing revenge against Joaquin Phoenix's ruthless Commodus. Fueled by a straightforward, compelling vengeance story with large-scale spectacle, Gladiator's major impact was reviving the sword and sandal epic that dominated the 50s and 60s, and making it accessible to a contemporary audience, very much providing the same thrills and excitement as what the crowds in the Colosseum experienced themselves. And still today, the movie is as watchable as ever, and still carries a resonance with today's audiences, hence why we saw the recent sequel Gladiator 2 being released in 2024. The original was a major box office success as well, winning multiple Oscars, including the one for Best Movie, although Ridley Scott sadly lost out for the one for Best Director. The movie also turned actor Russell Crowe into a major A-list superstar, and the impact of the film was seen right throughout the decade, with a string of big-budget historical epics that followed from the likes of Troy, The Last Samurai, Alexander, and Kingdom of Heaven. While some were superior to others, Gladiator remains right at the top of the list, and definitely one of the most impactful films within the 2000s decade. We then come up to the runner-up on this list, and it is the first Iron Man film from 2008. The first cinematic outing of the Marvel Comics character starred Robert Downey Jr. in the lead role as Tony Stark, the billionaire philanthropist and technological expert, escaping capture from terrorists and then going on to construct a techno-armor suit to take on all evil forces all over the world. And the movie earns its place on this list for so many reasons. First, it was one of the big movies taking a B or C list comic book character and going on to achieve major blockbuster success outside the three most iconic superheroes being Superman, Spider-Man and Batman. As a counterpoint to The Dark Knight, it showed superhero movies could be bright, colourful, fun and still very successful. It was also the start of the major career comeback for Robert Downey Jr., the talented yet troubled actor who infused his own natural charisma into the portrayal of Tony Stark and would later go on to become one of the biggest superstars of the next decade. But of course, the biggest distinction of this film was being the first step of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a franchise that without X-Men and Spider-Man would have to utilise the B and C list characters such as Thor, Captain America and Doctor Strange, and would ultimately convert them into cultural mainstream properties. And over a 13-year spell, the franchise would go on to dominate the entertainment industry like no other has done so before. The fact will always remain that without any Iron Man, you simply have no MCU. All of the extreme highs and cultural successes of the Avengers movies and Black Panther all doesn't happen if the first Iron Man film flops. So without question, one of the most important movies of the decade, and also within the genre itself, within the first Iron Man film. We then come on to number 1 on this list, the most influential movies or set of movies within the decade, and it is of course the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Peter Jackson's magnificent adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's iconic fantasy novels, focusing on young Hobbit Frodo and his quest to destroy the Ring of Power to stop the evil forces of Sauron conquering all of Middle-earth. And yes, we really have to include all 3 films, which not only invigorated the sword and fantasy genre for the modern age, but also set an elite standard of movie making that, if we're being honest, still remains unmatched today. The trilogy has absolutely everything from story, spectacle, effects and characters that all reach intense heights of excitement and emotion all the way through. It remains still to this day the greatest cinematic trilogy of all time, and still the only trilogy that gets better with each installment. Now all 3 movies, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers and The Return of the King, were amongst the highest grossing films of the respective years that they were released, winning multiple recognition and awards. The crowning achievement came in 2003 when The Return of the King would go on to win 11 Oscars and gross over $1.1 billion worldwide. And the huge impact and success of these films made other studios film their trilogies back to back. We would see many standalone stories be extended to 2 or 3 parts in order to cash in on the extra financial success. And we even saw this with Peter Jackson himself, coming back to the franchise with the Hobbit trilogy in 2012, and that trilogy really should have been 2 movies but ultimately got expanded to 3. We also saw a huge trend of extended cuts of films released, and that standard was really set by the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings films, which incredibly turned out to be even greater than the theatrical versions themselves. So all in all, a monumental trilogy, without question, the most impactful and influential sets of films within the 2000s decades, and that title has and will always remain with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So there's some of my thoughts and feelings when looking back at the most impactful and influential films within the 2000s decade. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you have any other movies, television series or any other issues within the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd like to see me cover within the channel, then also drop me a suggestion within the comments and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that topic within the future. Please consider hitting like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves and I will see you very, very soon.